I think we're actually already recording, so we'll probably trim some of that. Okay, so there's still a few people coming in, but I want to go ahead and introduce our very special guest, Leah Libresco Sargeant is a blogger, author, most recently of Building the Benedict Option, which I highly recommend, by the way. And for those of you who were able to see her speech just a few minutes ago, she's going to be talking to us about visibility for the vulnerable in our society in this time of pandemic. I hope you guys got to catch that. It was an excellent address that she had for us this evening. And now that she's here with us, we can kind of open up the floor for general questions. I think I'll start though with Skylar Kovich, our outreach director. I know definitely wanted to be here. I just made him a panelist, so I'll kind of let him lead the direction of discussion. And then we can, after that, we can kind of open it up to anyone who has any questions for Leah. So, and thank you very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
All right, Skylar, are you there? Well, he's in the chat, but okay. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. I'm not sure if Skylar's going to join the discussion or not, but so maybe you can just talk a little bit about your own experience during this pandemic and maybe how it, you and your family and, you know, being in quarantine, especially I know in the Northeast, it's been a little bit more intense than it has been in some other parts of the country, and kind of how your personal experiences have contributed to some of the reflections that you've shared with us about how we relate to our neighbors and to the most vulnerable people in society.
Well, first of all, my family's been really lucky. You know, we're a little out of the most trafficked areas of the Northeast. And we're actually kind of lucky in that I had a baby in January. And you might not think, you know, having a baby is the best way to prepare for a pandemic, but it's really great because our baby really just doesn't care that there's a pandemic. She wants to see us. She wants to play with us. It's not a time of catastrophe for her. It's a pretty joyful time, and that carries over to us. Now, in our community as a whole, you know, right when things started getting tough, we went around our neighborhood. My husband designed signs to remind people to cancel gatherings before everyone had canceled them, to stay apart, to wash their hands, to wear masks. And we just, you know, put up his art with staplers all over town. And in part, you know, we liked having his handmade art as a way of showing that we're doing this together, right? That this is something that's both coming from the top down when we listen to experts, but it's neighbors taking care of each other because it's the local communities where both disease spreads and where we're dependent on each other. And on my street itself, I went door to door and dropped off in everyone's mailbox a little invitation to sign up for a Google group so we could help each other out. And to be honest, we've been spared enough that most of what's happened has been a couple who was in quarantine asking to have stamps dropped off for them. A few porch happy hours, but now there's a bigger mutual aid group that someone else put together for the whole city. And that's been really wonderful because people have been able to give rent assistance. We've donated supplies for other new moms. And I'm just really proud of what's been going on. And there are a lot of people I want to meet in person when this is all over.
Okay, great. I see Skylar is actually back with us. Skylar, I don't know if you had a direction that you kind of wanted to take the discussion before we open it up to everybody.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So, yeah, I mean, of course, it's really important to be very focused on why we're all here, which the party as an organization is really important for meeting like-minded people. But the economic and social change that we want to create is the real reason why we're all here. But I guess to shift gears a little bit toward the party, what do you think are some realistic goals for the party as an organization over the next few years, not only to grow as a party, but also to be a part of building a better society?
Yeah, I think one goal that unfortunately isn't possible in every state, but I'm from New York originally, and New York lets candidates run on multiple lines. So where I grew up, there was something called the Working Families Party, and they would endorse candidates separately from the Democrats or Republicans, and votes cast for candidates on the Working Families line counted, period. And it's a way for people to still be able to vote for mainstream candidates, but to put a little pressure on them that they want to be able to appear on the Working Families line, so they need to accord with enough of their policies or goals to get that additional endorsement. And then all those votes are counted, so people know, oh, we voted for candidate A, but we voted on the Working Families Party line because we wanted to support the parts of their platform that overlap there. I'd love to see the ASP get to do that in states where that's possible. On the much smaller level, there was a project a friend of mine came up with in college. He was an Obama supporter, and his name was David Manners Weber, and he had a project called Obama Works, where people would just go pick up litter or clean up cities and just do simple, basic, everyday service and say, we're doing it because we support this candidate, and because we support them, we want to be part of taking care of our community. And I think that's a great way for people in the ASP to get involved, to do good things and tell them you're there because this is part of what the ASP values are.
Thank you.
So I see we've had a couple of questions about something pretty different, actually, but both of them were interested in your career as a statistician and some of your previous work. So Bryce says, I saw on your website that you've done some work on Bayesian framework of thinking. As a statistician who favors that framework, do you think that it would be helpful in finding common ground in our polarized world?
All right, it's Friday night. It's time for nerds. So welcome, everyone. Let me give a very brief introduction to what Bryce is asking about for folks who didn't come here for statistics primarily. Bayesian statistics, just to put it very simply, says, what do you already think? And then when you see a new piece of evidence, how much should it shift where you are from where you started to where you end up? There's a lot more math to it, but the simple thing of it is it starts with the fact that you have a prior belief or a prior model of the world. And each new piece of evidence is a chance to tweak or alter or shift that model or understanding. And then there's more math. But you may be used to in school having kind of a model of statistics that's okay, you flip a weighted coin and that acts as though you're standing outside the world, that you come to the probability or evidence for the first time freshly. So I actually think Bayes is a good way of thinking. It's a good model for statistics, but it's helpful in how we think about how we speak to each other, especially across disagreements. People come into a disagreement with a prior belief about the world, and that belief has been shaped by their whole experience of life up to date. It's kind of heavy if you think of it that way. It's heavy with the weight of the evidence or the model they have so far. And even if you have something very persuasive as a piece of new evidence, it's only going to tug them so far away from their prior belief because you're one person in one conversation. And even if you're right, it takes a while to change your mind, and that's reasonable. Pursuing the truth is always a matter of being part of a relay race. And I think that's a helpful thing to remember when we talk about evidence and when we talk about disagreements.
So kind of in that vein, since we were talking about statistics, someone was interested in your previously writing for 538, and they were wondering about party growth and specifically how we can get exposure in bigger outlets. The ASP, I don't think I'm giving the game away by saying that, we tend to get a fair bit of coverage in some fairly niche outlets, especially those that cater to a Catholic audience. That's just, kind of been our party history. And so they were kind of interested in if you had any thoughts on media strategy for, expanding our exposure.
I think if you're not already writing or pitching for those smaller outlets or kind of more niche outfits, start there to build up your clips. So if you go to a more mainstream outlet, you can point to other things you've done and say, please let me write for you on this. I have an interesting idea and here's what it is. When you're pitching elsewhere, you're going to need some kind of interesting hook. And I think it's good to think about looking local, looking specific, looking for individuals and interviews, because there's a lot of op-eds and a lot of opinions in the world. And I think it's a bigger draw to say, I'm interested in writing about the ASP, or I'm interested in writing about the goals of the ASP. I want to start with something specific of a project that fits into their overall political project, or a bill and I want to pitch writing on this specific group of people, and I'm going to interview this person if you're interested, editor. Get really focused on what are you drawing on that isn't just a general piece of political philosophy.
It's kind of along that same line, I'm fielding a question from Terry Mattingly here. He says, how do we get past the point of being the giant Meteor 2016 t-shirt option? More specifically, how do you explain why the party as a project matters to you or why it's worthwhile?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about it not just as a rejection of other options, but putting forward what you want to support. Because if you just want a protest vote, you can write in your dog. You can be Mitt Romney and write in your wife or your husband or your mom or dad. So part of it is that you're picking something not just to reject the options on the table in front of you, but to be really specific about what you're looking for, unless Mitt Romney is very specifically looking for his wife to be president. But I think that's not exactly how he's explained that framing of his vote. And I think it is useful for people to keep thinking about, first of all, getting informed about politics on the local level where you live, and then taking a cue from folks like the Justice Democrats, or the DSA, who have been trying to win local races and make the case that they can deliver on these policies for the people they live among and serve.
Yeah, I saw someone was typing in the chat, DSA, DSA, DSA. I think they must be in favor of that model, which I think a lot of us do look to that as a model for, potentially how we can make a difference even without, working on the same level as the Democrats or Republicans.
Do you see any models related to that on the conservative side moving forward?
It's interesting. None that are as successful as kind of the recent things. The Tea Party movement brought a lot of folks to Congress, but hasn't, I'll be honest, had much of a positive impact even from the point of view of people who voted for them. And I'd say that because they weren't very interested in how governing works or making commitments about getting involved in that. So there's been more rhetoric than results there. But I think, the rallies and the looking for ways, like I guess the most charitable thing I can say there is that looking for ways to bring people out who didn't feel like they had a voice worked well. The Tea Party is focused on Obamacare and candidate visits back to their constituencies. And so if I were going to pull one thing from that lesson on the right, it was reminding people they really can turn out and ask questions of their elected representatives. And if you show up in force, hopefully, with enthusiastic but respectful dissent, you have a chance to move the needle a little bit.
So shifting gears for a minute, back to the virus and the question of, responding to the most vulnerable people in our society. I have a question from Nicholas Matea. He says, I have a daughter with a genetic condition that brings with it several health issues. And during the pandemic, we've been confronted with two problems. Therapies that she needs that have been stopped in order to prevent disease spread. And also, on the other hand, people refusing to wear masks, becoming indignant when asked to wear a mask when I tell them that my daughter is immunocompromised. And he's just interested in you exploring these kinds of issues when it comes to the preferential option for vulnerable people.
Hey, Nicholas. First of all, I'm really sorry that this time has brought even more challenges to your family, especially the challenge of seeing other people be at least seemingly careless with the health of other folks, especially the people who are most vulnerable. I think masks are really a way for us to think about how we talk about our responsibility to care for each other and to care for the vulnerable. Initially, masks were discussed as a way of protecting oneself, and kind of a little too quickly dismissed by some health experts there as well. But the reason we wear masks is primarily to protect each other. It's to protect people like your daughter, but it's to protect everyone. The more folks wear masks, the fewer viral particles spread. And, honestly, if before this pandemic, you had told people that they have a huge chance to save a life, in a pretty small way, and wearing the mask when they go to the grocery store and going for walks without one, putting one on when someone else is nearby, and that every day you might have the chance to save someone else's life. I think in the abstract, that idea is thrilling. But in practice, I think we don't talk about it as being as much of an opportunity in the middle of a hard time as it could be. That wearing a mask isn't a kind of boring, difficult duty. And it's not something I like doing a great deal either. It's sweaty and humid and I hate it. But I don't usually get the chance to make such a difference directly for other people. Usually when I help someone else, it's kind of through the distance of my dollars by making a donation to something that eventually will help someone else. I think really leaning into the romanticism of, when you tie on your bandana and look like a bandit, that you're making a real effort to save someone else's life.
So we had another question from Terry. He was talking about creating an ad featuring a Lech Walesa clip, something to show the global reality of this political vision. I guess he's getting at sort of, whether it's a good idea to sort of market the Solidarity Party in that tradition, which I think was incidentally part of the inspiration for the name of the party in the first place, is the allusion to the Polish experience. But
I think it's a great idea to make connections to other times and places, in part to, as I said in my talk earlier, to jar us out of the idea that the present political conventional wisdom is all that is possible. And talking about what has been done in other times and places, different policies, different ways of organizing our society is a real gift, because it kind of breaks the narrowness of the news and of the way people think about political realities. I'll drop in a book recommendation here. I'm really looking forward to reading Alan Jacobs's Breaking Bread with the Dead, which is a book coming out this fall. And it's really about the way that looking outside your own time and place gives you a real injection of fresh ideas of what is possible.
let's see. Someone else asked about marketing the particular political values that we have to non-Christians.
Yeah, well, obviously the best thing you can do is ask a non-Christian friend who you think might be interested to look over the website or look over the materials and say what here attracts you, what here gives you concern. I think it's a good idea to look at some interfaith historical movements about how people drew in folks who believed in the cause without necessarily believing in the full understanding of the world advanced by people in that cause. I think the American Civil Rights Movement is a good example of a movement that was profoundly shaped by Christianity, but not exclusive to Christians.
So there's a word that came up a few times in your talk that you're definitely not going to hear at the Democratic or Republican conventions this year, and that's usury, which I may make some people a little bit uncomfortable in bringing this up, because it is something that kind of touches on our economic reality in a very radical way. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the idea you were exploring, that kind of in the Christian tradition, there's this deeply rooted idea that people's fundamental needs are not just a matter of the marketplace in the way that some other goods and services may be, and sort of what the pandemic is teaching us about that.
Yeah, so I was drawing from a book called The Gift by Lewis Hyde, which isn't a specific Christian theological or economic work. It's actually primarily about art. But in his discussion of usury and why it was banned, he said it was equivalent to standing in the river of excess wealth that's meant to flow from people with wealth to people that have need. And he kind of used the image of usury being as though you're standing in that river and diverting the stream for yourself. And I think we talk today, and the reason I like this point about usury, we talk as though, it's always a matter of active choice to give what we have to people who need. We don't have to do it, but we generously choose to. And that's not the way that St. Basil the Great, for example, talks about it. He doesn't say, it's a good idea to give the extra coat in your closet to someone in need. He says the extra coat in your closet belongs to the person who has none. You're sitting on it, you're keeping it. You're not choosing to give up what is yours. It was never yours at all when someone else's need was that abject. And I think that really ties back to Lewis's point, that there's a natural flow of wealth from people who have to people who need. I think a lot of people have experienced this to an extent, depending on where you live in your community during the pandemic and in the wake of the protests, where, people just come out with supplies after a cataclysm to care for each other. And what Hyde is telling us and St. Basil is telling us is that actually is our baseline relationship to each other. And we build up things that take us away from it, and our own sin and our own error takes us away from it. But that flow is as natural and necessary as water flowing downstream. And getting in the way of that is a grave error.
So I see someone in the chat box was talking about the question of pandemic response and different levels of political organization, federal, local, and so on, and sort of that question of whether you need a unified national effort versus different jurisdictions trying to combat it on their own, and just if you have thoughts about that particular problem of response.
It's worth making local efforts, but the questioner, Brandon, is right that a national response and a global response are also necessary. And unfortunately, we've seen those be really deficient. We can make individual sacrifices, we can make individual efforts, but for something like a pandemic, it's right there in the name, pan, everywhere. It's really a question of us all pulling together. And I think there's a reason that people have kind of reached for, and my husband among them, the iconography of World War II propaganda posters sometimes when they're trying to come up with motivational images to take care of each other. Because it's that question of, well, shouldn't we, in the middle of a crisis and a disaster, feel like we're all part of one effort? And that what I do here not only protects my own community, but protects everyone. And I'm relying not just on the people who live on my street, but I'm relying on people who live 3 states away to all pull together. And I think we've really seen a lack of that language of solidarity from the very top. And it really kneecaps us. To sustain this, you have to keep being reminded that everyone else is working on this too, and that does have to be true.
So one thing that has come up in kind of the Christian press in the last few months during the pandemic, and you'll probably have seen this if you read, First Things, for example, is, some people are responding to things like closing churches, and they have criticized some of the pandemic response because they think it sort of subordinates, spiritual goods or other kinds of goods in human life to a fear of death or that sort of thing. And of course, the response is, well, it's not just about that; it's about caring for your neighbor, just like you've been talking about. But I'm wondering if you have thought about that issue in particular, about the degree to which we, assume burdens in order to prevent physical harm versus other values.
Well, when we talk about Christian experience and Christian life specifically, Christians kind of live a paradox. We're told to be profligate with our own lives. We're given the examples of the martyrs. We're all told to follow Christ and be willing to lay down our life for our friends. Now, in some ways that makes it sound like, truly, we're not called to be afraid of death. We're not called to be servile in an attempt to avoid it. That's a really different call, though, than being careless about other people's health and asking them to put their lives on the line so that you can go about your life as you're accustomed to it. So I think the folks who have talked about this as a fear of death is what's leading people to be careful about coronavirus are in error. And I think they're taking what's a real call, which is to not value our own lives above the call to holiness and above the call to care for others, and warping it to make it about a call to live our ordinary lives, which are not, for the most part, well aligned with the life crisis called us to, without concern for others. Now, having said that, it is a tragedy not to be able to go to Mass, and it is a tragedy not to receive the Eucharist. It's a real privation, and I don't want to minimize kind of the weight of our sacrifice here. But what I would say is that, calling back to the quote from Pope Francis that I used in my talk just a little bit ago, that part of our error is thinking that we can live, a full and healthy life in a world that is sick. And I think there's an opportunity to offer our distance from church, our distance from each other in reparation for the sins we've committed that have fallen in a heavy way on people, not ourselves. Right, so I live in the suburbs. I go to Mass every weekend. I get to go to Mass in daily Mass usually. All that's been suspended. We've only just reopened. But because of my own limitedness in evangelization and support for missions, there are people who go to Mass once a month, and that's normally not in pandemic. Because of our own cowardice, in standing up to China's repression of Christians, of their repression of Uyghur, there are people who cannot worship openly at all. And so I think there is an invitation to enter into that sacrifice and the weight of what others experience in a time that isn't a pandemic and say, well, this is a hard fast and I want to offer it for the people who experience this privation all the time, and not because of some dispassionate virus, but because of human evil.
Okay, on that note, I think we're coming to the end of our time here, but I really want to thank you again for joining us, both for the speech and for the Q&A. You've given us a lot to think about. I hope this has been profitable for our members and for everyone who's going to see it once we actually get it broadcast out there. But thank you again. And those of you who are here who are our delegates, we'll see you in just a few minutes starting out, and stay tuned for more convention events. Thank you again, Leah.
All right, thank you, ASP.
Good night, everybody.